Hello, my friends. Welcome to 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 through 1994, where we take a look at the most impactful albums during those years, and we do it chronologically or as close to it as I can. We are now in the year 1965, season number 2. I am your host, Jay Sweet. For this episode, we're going to check out Horace Silver's album, Song for My Father, which was released in January of 1965 on the Blue Note label, but it was actually recorded over 2 dates, or 3 if you include the alternate tracks, but those 2 dates for the original LP are October 31st, 1963, Halloween, and then about a year later, October 26th, 1964. Joining me on this podcast is Steve Myerson, a fantastic piano player and educator. I had the opportunity to play with Steve just the one time, actually. I'm sure we'll do it again, but it was quite enjoyable. So I talked to Steve not only about Horace Silver and the album, but also about his life. So I split that into 2 sections. So there is an interview section with just Steve talking about what's going on with him. And then, of course, his impressions on Horace Silver and the record are included on this broadcast as well. So anyway, let's just get into it. Horace Silver's Song for My Father, January 1965, Blue Note Records. Enjoy. Okay, so let's learn a little bit about Horace Silver's early life and career. Horace Silver was born in Norwalk, Connecticut, and had a mixed race, including white, black, Portuguese, and Native American relatives. Silver often borrowed elements from these cultures' music as a composer, and was particularly inspired by Cape Verde Island music, where his father was born. Horace Silver began early music training on the tenor saxophone and the piano, but eventually settled on the piano by the late 1940s. While a fine pianist, he was not a virtuoso like Art Tatum or Bud Powell, and he performed mainly in a hybrid bop and swing style, and focused much of his attention on writing original music. By 1950, Horace Silver was leading a trio in Hartford, Connecticut. During this time, he came to the attention of saxophonist Stan Getz and served as a pianist with his band. After making his first recordings with Getz, Silver moved to New York and backed stars like Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, and a young alto saxophonist named Lou Donaldson. Expected to enter the studio with Donaldson in 1952, the saxophonist never made the session, and Silver served as the de facto bandleader for the date. The record includes Art Blakey on drums and Curly Russell on bass, and it resulted in a release of New Faces and New Sounds, that's Silver's first album from that session. And it offered 6 original Horace Silver tracks, including Quicksilver and Horoscopes. After recording his first album as a leader, Silver continued to work as a sideman with artists like Miles Davis, Milt Jackson, Sonny Stitt, Howard McGee, and many others. Many of Silver's sessions at the time also included drummer Art Blakey, so the two decided to join forces as the Jazz Messengers. As part of the group, Silver remained one of the group's principal writers. His gospel-inspired song, The Preacher, from the album Horace Silver and the Jazz Messengers, that's Blue Note Records, received crossover success and showcased a new hybrid jazz style that became known as hard bop. So let's talk a little bit about hard bop music. By the early to mid-1950s, jazz music had changed considerably and began a slow decline in popularity as audiences developed new interest in rhythm and blues and early rock and roll. While swing music dominated the 1930s and early 1940s, several musicians adopted a style known as bebop and cool jazz by the mid-1940s, which moved the music in a direction that was less concerned with entertaining and more geared towards a listening audience. With the death of Charlie Parker in 1955, it seemed clear that the popularity of bebop was also nearing its end. While some musicians looked to the more subdued and classically influenced cool jazz style that Miles Davis and his contemporaries popularized, others were not ready to entirely abandon the language of bebop. Several musicians and critics began to feel that cool jazz had moved jazz away from its original roots and deep connection with African rhythms. To To return jazz to a style more connected to the African American experience, several jazz musicians began incorporating the music of the black church fused with the blues, R&B, and bebop to create a style known as hard bop. Unlike cool jazz, which focused more on written structures and softer textures, hard bop musicians relied heavily on improvisation connected with a bebop language and the music of the black church. Other labels used to define the style include post-bop, but most frequently, it's known as hard bop. Art Blakey and pianist Horace Silver were two of the most celebrated figures to incorporate the hard bop style. So, about the album, Song for My Father. In 1956, Silver was growing frustrated by the heroin usage within the Jazz Messengers band, and he left the group. He soon formulated his quintet, with Junior Cook on tenor sax, Blue Mitchell on trumpet, Gene Taylor on bass, and Roy Haynes on drums. With the group, Silver continued to offer a post-bop mix of swing, gospel, blues, and island-influenced compositions, otherwise hard bop. And several of the songs were released as popular jukebox singles, several of their recordings. But his most famous album would be Song for My Father, which was inspired by a trip that Silver made to Brazil. The album includes 3 session dates with 3 different bands. These dates are October 31st, 1963, January 28th, 1964, and October 26th, 1964. Each of the 6 tracks on the original album are original compositions, 5 by Silver and 1 by saxophonist Joe Henderson. The album cover shows a picture of Horace Silver's father. So, as promised, I discussed Horace Silver and the album with Steve Myerson. So here we go. Here's my interview with Steve Myerson regarding the record and Horace Silver. So if you could, just give me your, maybe just a general overall impression of Horace Silver, first as a piano player.
Absolutely. I mean, Horace Silver to me, being such a unique voice, like there's nobody else that sounds what he could do, or could play. And it's not so much a technical thing like showy flashy notes, or some pianists have just like chops galore. Now don't get me wrong, Horace had all the chops in the world. In fact, I would go to say he was so mature as a player that it would take more chops to pull off what he did at the piano, because he had such a touch and a depth of feel and groove in his playing. And it wasn't about the amount of notes, but it was about the right notes at the right time, the placement and the feel. And he was experimenting. When you listen to the music, he was experimenting with specific bass lines, and you Jay, being a bass player, I'm sure and you've heard this. I've if I can quote, I've heard Todd Coleman talk about this, and Todd worked with Horace for many years. That Horace used to write out and have very specific parts for the bass. And I find, from the piano perspective, as a pianist who's come, from the influence of Horace Silver, I love a player who could use left hand and do it not so much in a way that like Art Tatum would do it,
Right.
or even Bud Powell. Horace just had his own thing. One of those textures, besides like bass lines, would be kind of these, I don't know what in New Orleans you call it, like gruffs, these kind of like vroom, vroom, kind of like, like really low staccato chords. They're just short little accentuations. And I think that was an innovation of Horace, is that he doesn't get enough credit for, but just innovating the way that the piano's approach. He had a soulful approach. They some call it like hard bop,
Yeah.
or post bop or whatever. But to me, he was taking every part of the history of the music, coming from, whether it be, all the way down to like Congo Square, the rhythms that we've all heard being
Sure.
talked about, and witnessed. African rhythms, you know, the cries and the screams and the yells, you know,
Mm.
and the pain was in his playing. So was the celebration and the joy, you know, and you
Sure.
could hear that, and that comes out in the blues, you know. He's playing the blues, and so I think when you take all that and take the gospel and take the swing, um, you know, you get Horace Silver, you know, and you get this wonderful pianist, and that's him to me. I mean, it's kind of hard to put into words what we're gonna listen to in music, but you know, they would say, "How do you talk about music? You have to listen to music." But if you
Of course.
listen to Horace, you kind of will get a sense of what I'm just trying to talk about, but the tip of the iceberg of what his playing is and what it means to me. It's definitely affected me as a player, for sure.
Interesting. Yeah, because he's like one of these guys in terms of just piano playing, um, that you don't often hear piano players reference as a major technical influence. I would say I rarely read about a player who mentions Horace Silver is like the person they maybe tried to emulate. And he came up in like a very specific time. I mean, I guess kind of move that swing and then bebop, and of course he helped to develop that style that some people now call hard bop. But never really fell into the bebop tradition specifically. I never felt, or never really just a consummate like swing player. He had sort of this his own thing, and of course that island influence as well, filtered in. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. You know, the island influence, the you know, the Caribbean, or you know, like I'm half Puerto Rican, so you know, the salsa music, you
Sure.
know, um all of that became part of his language and his influence. And he was checking out everything. He was checking out not just that, he was checking out Indian music, you know, even European music. I mean, Horace Silver absorbed it all. And I've heard him on interviews even talking about that specifically. So yeah, I agree, and I think like for me specifically as a pianist, what I'm attracted to about his piano playing is the melodicism, you know, because we're in an age right now where, you know, access to YouTube and you know, lots of records and so forth. I'm seeing younger players with chops that I can't even dream of playing all this stuff. But yet when it comes to Horace, it kind of like goes over their head a little bit, you know? And to me, this is what we say, you know, me and my buddies when we're talking about certain kinds of music, this is grown people's music, you know, grown
Yeah.
folks' music. So listening to Horace, you know, you just have to open your ears to receive the melody that he's trying to give us. You know, there's a spirituality to it, I think. You know, and oh, and by the way, I should mention that to your listeners, you know, and maybe there's a jump in the gun because this happened way later in his career, but he was literally into the healing of music. He created an organization about, you know, basically using music. He actually made, I think, 4 recordings that you can't find anywhere
Hmm.
of healing music, and like he was into the metaphysical side of music. So, you know, that's a lot of people don't know about that, but,
Wasn't.
yeah, he started his own record label and made I believe it was 4 metaphysical albums that he used to sell to, like, hospitals, you know, seniors folks' home, and he would go around giving concerts just to try to use music to heal. And he actually wrote songs and created chants and kind of like, you know, what do you call it, island music, you know, like Caribbean rhythms, that were very much like into that meditative kind of state, or the hope was to get people to use that meditation, to try to kind of heal their minds while they were healing their bodies, you know, and so a lot of people don't know that about Horace, you know.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. I think it was Stanley Jordan. I ran into him at a
Oh
jam,
wow.
and he was talking about playing in hospitals, and there was a discovery, or a certain physicians or surgeons had decided that it would be better to use less anesthesia, and that there was enough healing power within the music that it worked. And he would actually, if and I may have this wrong, but I think he mentioned that he was actually playing in the operating room as people were being worked on, which,
Whoa, that's
so,
incredible.
yeah, so
That's
going back to that healing power of music, which you mentioned earlier, when we were talking about your upbringing and stuff, it's pretty crazy, right?
Yeah, there's something to it, no doubt. You know, I think we're just scratching. We as humanity, we're just scratching the surface of what our brains are capable of, you know. And you definitely hear about hypnosis being a tool for healing for people who have chronic pain.
Right.
But I think music has a similar effect, you know, I really do. And listening to Horace's music, sometimes as a fan of the music, I just turn it on and you know, I just kind of zone out sometimes if I'm having a bad day or whatever it might be. Even if I'm not feeling well, you know, I turn on music and it's like all of a sudden, you know, I just started getting into singing. I'm not much of a singer, but I love to sing.
Right.
And I took some lessons about, you know, using your like breathing techniques, and I could tell you firsthand how much singing has helped heal my body when I've been sick, where I just start breathing and my it's like my allergies start going away. You know, you start singing certain melodies and your body just says, you know, I don't have time to get sick right now. You know, I got
Right.
to sing or I got to play. So
Yeah.
there's something to it for sure.
That's amazing. So yeah, so to bring it back to Horace Silver, and I think this is probably true of any musician. I feel like a lot of the people he played with before he became sort of a solo artist, if you will. Um, Stan Getz, Coleman Hawkins, I believe, Lester Young, all players who had a certain degree of technicality for sure, but they didn't rely on that technicality necessary to get their message across musically. And I feel like Horace Silver, see, I've never really thought of him as a purely technical player. As a piano player, you mentioned he does have that level of skill. Not that I think he was amateurish at all. I think he's quite gifted and quite remarkable, but he never relied purely on technicality, in my estimation, to connect with an audience.
Yeah, I think that's true. But like I'll give you one example. There's a tune he wrote called Room 608,
Sure.
you know, and if you listen, it's like I mean, it's when you listen to the recording, it's so swinging, it's so fast, and
Mm.
his solo is perfection. If you want to transcribe a great solo on a rhythm changes, with like a different bridge, you know, check out what he plays on there, and it's technically challenging. He's one of those guys that to me is very deceptive technical, you know. So you listen to it at first, you're like, oh, I can do that, you know.
Right.
But there's a reason why Horace Silver is Horace Silver because no, nobody could do what he did. It was very technically demanding. Even the simplest of melodies, it was about again, not the physicality of playing the note like one note to the next, but I think the all the nuance. If you really listen to it with open ears, there's such great nuance to his phrasing, his dynamics, his touch, his accentuations,
Mm.
his melodic sensibility, you know, the logic behind it. I mean, I go on and on about how it is technical, but yet perfectly melded with that spirituality too. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think you've explained it perfectly. Um, in terms of Silver as a composer, can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I just mentioned Room 608, which I'll start there. You know, to me, that has, I mean, so-called like bebop, you know, melodic sensibility, right? It's coming from Charlie Parker, you know, it's coming from Diz, it's coming from Miles. But the funny thing is, like Horace Silver, he could do that bebop stuff, but then he could also do his own thing, you know. Not, I mean, he owned bebop, so to speak, right? But then he wrote "Song for My Father," you know,
Mhm.
and that whole album, bringing it to "Song for My Father," for example, I think it's like the first 4 or 5 tracks, maybe the first 4 tracks, there's almost like a concept going on, you know. As a composer, he's really coming into his own, where he's using these bass figures. He's really putting a lot of thought into the arrangement, not just the composition. And the arrangement is part of the composition, so to speak. So he's got these like bass grooves, there's some stuff in the drums, there's like some percussion parts that to me, whether they were composed or not, I mean, from what I've heard, it sounds like they were very well thought out and at least talked about in the studio. I don't think they were all completely off the cuff improvised, you know.
Right.
A lot of that stuff was worked out. but it's because he had a vision in his mind of what the music was supposed to sound like, you know? And so as a composer, that would be what I noticed the most, is that there's vision, there's thought, there's purpose, you know. And Horace Silver, everything he wrote had some kind of just grand. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, but it was very personal to him, you know. It was a grand vision, and he was able. I mean, think about that too. He was able to put the bands together, the right musicians, for his vision, you know, to help bring that together too. So that's a big part. So it's all encompassing. It took him writing the music, and it took him listening to all kinds of world music that I know that he was into, and being open enough to receive all that and be inspired by that, and then to write a tune like, you know, a song for my father. Or there's another one on there called Que Pasa that I really like, you
Yeah.
know. And
But
so yeah.
they're a little similar in some ways, the opening at
Right.
least. Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, how many brilliant musicians have come in and out of his group, you know, and he was still sort of able to retain that connectivity, um, to get his musical vision across. Because his music always sounds like Horace Silver music, you know. I mean, there is a stream throughout, I think, where you know after the first few measures that this is a Horace Silver vehicle.
Right away, you know, I can tell. What's interesting about that, going back to his playing, right,
Right.
and his writing. So I'll speak on both of those at the same time. Just to kind of accentuate what you said, you know, I recognize Horace Silver right away, just like I recognize Ahmad Jamal, because
Hmm.
there's a certain concept that's only definable by the individual person. You know, it's like, you can try to sound like Ahmad Jamal, but I know it's not Ahmad Jamal. You know, or you can try to sound like Horace Silver, but I know it's not Horace Silver. There's something very unique and distinct about Horace's voice, as the writer, you know. And that's happened to me time and time again. I can't name a specific song, but you know, things that have come up on the radio or just randomly in my playlist, and I'm not paying attention to it, and I said, man, that sounds like Horace Silver, and it is. You
Right.
know. So there's something to that for sure. He absolutely had his own voice.
Yeah, and then the other thing I wanted to speak to or get your impression on, for me, Horace Silver, just in terms of just like really focusing in on his improvisation, and I think another figure who's kind of like this is John Lewis from like the Modern Jazz Quartet. These
Mm.
guys were deeply connected with composition, who compose a lot, which Horace Silver, most of his albums are, you know, particularly like on Song for My Father, 5 of the 6 tunes are his. You know, he wrote them, the other being Joe Henderson's the kicker, right? But it's almost like his improvisational style is very much like his compositional style. I hear, you can almost hear the wheels turning. It's like he a lot of times he'll play these shorter phrases and build upon them, rather than maybe do more of a sheets of sound, maybe type of a concept where he's playing these longer phrases, getting himself kind of into a situation and having to try to veer off. It almost seems like there's a plan, and I think that has a lot to do with just the fact that he had a composer's mind. What do you think on that?
Man, I mean, that couldn't be more correct, you know. And I'll tell you why, as a constant student that I am of the music, especially in our time,
Right,
um, compared to back then. Like for instance, now we've got access to everything, and we're expected to know everything. And as a working professional musician, like I have to know every song, I got to know every style. You know,
right,
it's a lot on my plate to be successful. You know, and it takes a ton of preparation, and so therefore, like right now, I don't stop learning, and I'm always having to practice. I mean, I love practicing. Don't get me wrong. Um, the reason why I say that is because, you know, it's very difficult to then find your own voice nowadays, you know. And I get students ask all the time, how do I find my own voice? I'll tell you a small story. When I was under the tutelage of James Williams, he was, so I was a student about 20, well, I won't say exactly how long, but years ago,
right.
at William Patterson, when James Williams was the director there, and I had the fortune of getting to know James and even taking a semester of lessons with him.
Uh,
And the first thing he said is, "What do you want to work on?" You know, because James was that kind of person. He was so helpful and giving, and he wouldn't dare say to like anybody, like I'm going to teach you this or I'm going to show you this, because you know he wouldn't want to tell you how to play. He wasn't that kind of person. He was like very just like a father figure in a way, as far as the music's concerned. you
Sure.
know what it was more about, like, what can I as a teacher do to bring something out of you. And so his first question was, well, what do you want to work on? And I said, James, I want to know, how do you find your own voice as an artist? And you'd be surprised what he told me. He said, you don't even worry about that. Just keep studying the music. Don't stop.
Right.
And I didn't understand back then what he was talking about. And now I think I do, which is, look, this music has such rich history, and there is so much on your plate. There is so much to learn that comes before you. Later on in the semester, we talked about writing a little bit, and he gave me another clue into finding your own voice, which I'm still trying to find. I mean, we all are trying to find our own voice, but he opened up a door to me, which is like, hey, why don't you write something? James was a prolific composer as well, just like Horace. And so what I found is, when I started writing songs, like my original tunes, it's a it's a scary proposition to sit down and write a tune, because it brings out you as a person, and you're revealing to the world who you are through that song. And so to do that honestly, and to do that with no filter, is, to me, it's terrifying as a writer.
Sure.
So I can only imagine, with everything I just said, everything on your plate, all the mentorship, all the knowledge, all the things you have to know, the people that you study with or don't, the ears or reading or whatever it might be. The bottom line is, when you sit down to write, it's just you and that pen. And so Horace Silver, let me bring it full circle to Horace. That's why, to me, it's even more amazing what he was able to do. Because, let's see, we're going back how many year about 60 years ago. you
Sure.
know there was a lot of knowledge, of course, of the music, but minus the 60 years that we've just had. And yet he was able to kind of put all that aside and reveal to the world his true self. And imagine doing that in the 1960s. How challenging that must have been,
Right.
for somebody, a black man from Connecticut,
Mhm.
um, to do what he did in the music, to change music, to affect it in such a way through his own original writing. That's why I preface my passion for Horace Silver's music and his writing with what I just said, because I can't even fathom what that was for him. The amount of the feelings that went behind it, to put pen and paper and write the way he wrote. It was so personal, so real, and so prolific that it did change music. So if you could just, and I'm just trying to paint a picture and describe it in such a small way, but yeah, it's really heavy to talk about Horace as a writer, in my opinion. And that's going from my own experience as a writer and a student of the music, but also just trying to respect and be humble to what he was and what he gave. So I hope I didn't get too wordy on that, but that's kind of my long
That's good.
roundabout answer to the question.
Yeah, yeah. No, I I get it, and I agree. It just one of these figures who made an impact because he was so unique, um, and also connecting with the tradition, which is, I think, what pretty much all of anyone who presents jazz. It's sort of almost a responsibility to not disregard the tradition, but still to try to find your own way of, like, now this music's it's been around since the 1920s, let's say, and developed, um and it's hard to find, like you say, your own individual voice. And I think if you work too hard to try to find it, you almost are forcing it. That's something that almost has to happen organically, and then of course it changes. Look at a guy like John Coltrane. Man, his voice changed dramatically throughout the course of his career.
Well, and that's just it. When you write and when you compose music, you're finding your voice organically, and therefore your playing changes. And that, I think that's what you were talking about earlier too, is the idea that writing and playing is kind of one and the same. So if you're going to become, I mean, this would be advice to the students out there who might be listening to this. If you really want to find your own voice and become a great improviser, well, what is improvising? It's composing on the spot. It's the only difference. It happens in real time. But you have to practice. You have to practice just like you practice your instrument. You have to practice writing, and there's a craft to it. And I think that's something to think about too, is, learn the craft. Don't just study how to play 2-5-1 licks all day, and don't just transcribe. Do those things, but do practice composing. I think that would be beneficial to anyone who's interested in being a great improviser, being able to play the music, but also in finding your own artistry.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. Yeah, and then so just the album specifically, "Song for My Father," probably his signature album, I would say. Um, what are your impressions on that particular album? I know you mentioned that you think that there's some sort of a stream that runs from song to song.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I think the first four songs, you got the song from my father, of course, which we all know, but the natives are restless tonight, Calcutta Cutie, Que Pasa. These songs, there seems to be some kind of a thread, and I found it interesting that when you get to the kicker, there's a change, and I'm sure that was on purpose. I would think, whether it was a producer call or Horace's call to kind of frame the album that way. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't know what order in the studio they recorded all these songs in, or if they even did it on the same day. I don't know
Yeah,
those
no, I
details.
mean, three different sessions, different musicians. Um, so which is pretty amazing, because there does seem to be this sort of thread in a way, but it was recorded over a course of a year almost.
Wow. So there you go. I didn't know that, but it I guess the timeline of when it was recorded, how many bands, how many different musicians, um, isn't as relevant when it comes to the production of the actual album, because when you put that all together, decisions were still made. Hey, let's put this song here and that song there, you know. And of course, adding at the end the pivotal music changing Lonely Woman, and I mean that song is just incredible. It's a whole. I think it, to me, Song for My Father is what everybody knows, but Lonely Woman is, to me, what defined that album
Interesting.
from
Okay.
from my personal ears, just what it does to me emotionally.
Right. The only trio track on the whole album.
That's right.
And if I'm not wrong, I think, yeah, that's the only, so that's was Gene Taylor and Roy Brooks on that one. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the only two. No, 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 they're on another track as well. But yeah, it's funny because for me, it's almost like that song, as much as I enjoy it, it almost feels like that was almost like we need to add a song to the track, to the album. And
And that might have been true. They might have added it in, late. I mean, every song on there was added at some point because of what you said. It was recorded three different sessions, three, different bands. But like I said, when the year came up and it was time to produce this record, is this on Blue Note? Yeah,
yeah,
this is a Blue Note album, right?
yeah,
So, it was produced, and this was a business decision, and
right.
so somebody said, I mean, it's, to your point, it's quite possible they said, hey, we just need one more track, and he said, hey, I got this trio track that I just threw together, let's try it out,
Yeah.
um but
But
but to
it
put
does
that
show,
song at the end.
yeah, you know what I love about it though, because at some points I feel like, and I don't think this is a flaw or even something that's negative. I like it. He can be very uh, forceful in his left hand playing, um,
Mhm.
and on that final track, "Lonely Woman," it almost has, if you will, like a more of a cool jazz sensibility. There's some more subtlety in his playing, and of course, because it's a trio, although he does solo quite a bit throughout the album, he really gets a chance to really develop the improvisation as well. and it sort of speaks to his ability to not play in one specific way. Like he was pretty versatile.
Absolutely. That's the thing, that the versatility is showing on this record, but it also shows through his influences. If you check out, there's a couple of interviews, and for those listeners that are interested, you can actually go on YouTube and just, check out Horace Silver interviews. And he's been interviewed several times, and he talks about this, what his influences were, and they're wide, they're varied. He was into good music, of any kind, from anywhere, and it's so funny because you mentioned like cool jazz. There's this whole, in the music, there's such a division, right? Because we as consumers of the music, the mass public, they need something to put their finger on. They need to say, oh, I want to buy rock and roll, or I want to buy heavy metal, or but then when you break all those categories down, there's subcategories, right? And there's all like jazz. Well, what is jazz? There's so many different variations of the music. So when you think about all that, where do you put, how do you define somebody like Horace Silver, who essentially, created this hard bop vibe? But what is hard bop? But everything. It's got all kinds of influences, and he talks about that. He talks about, Caribbean music. He talks about Indian music, chant music. I mean, he's just checking all of it out. Just as so for young musicians too, who are just learning and wanting to play this music. Something that always inspired me was never to close my ears off, and I'm sure you're the same, Jay. Like I think we've talked about this. You got to play, especially nowadays. You can't just say, I'm going to play this one kind of jazz, or I'm only going to be like a math metal guitarist, um, because how do you think those guys and gals became so good at what they do? It's because they checked it all out, and the more you listen to, and the more you decide for yourself. It's not that you have to like everything, but do listen as much as you can, to as much as you can, all kinds of music. And then from that, I think your ears will start to gravitate towards certain kinds of music, and certain kinds of music will resonate with you. And that's how you can decide, okay, how do I want to write, or how do I want to play? And after listening to interviews of Horace, I could say that's what he was doing. He was
Yeah.
just listening.
And that's, I think, most musicians do. I mean, God, even my own listening experience just this morning, and a lot of these things are for projects, but I listened to music from Trinidad, Nicki Minaj, Horace Silver, John Coltrane. I mean, that was my listening this morning, which is like,
That's quite a list.
it's right. And I don't think there's anyone in the world who listened to those four people like today, or those four, styles. It's just, but you have to be open to it. It's not something like, me personally, I wouldn't normally listen to a Nicki Minaj song, but I'm doing this project on the music of Trinidad. She's from Trinidad, so I look for
Oh,
a
wow.
connection. And I think one of the traps, and this is very much a marketing tool, but when, like, for example, if you look at traditional jazz history books, if you will, Horace Silver, the premier founder or co-founder, along with Art Blakey, of the hard bop style, perhaps the pianist maybe most associated with that style, and that style is a reaction against this more classical based cool jazz, which kind of moved the music away from the African roots, perhaps. And then you listen to a song like we're talking about, like Lonely Woman, and that could easily be fall into perhaps a cool jazz category. So I don't think he was reacting violently against other styles. It's just that he chose to play in this particular style at that particular moment.
I agree, 100%. I couldn't have said it better myself, but I did think of an analogy, a little bit of an analogy. If you enjoy martial arts in any way, I like, throughout my life, kind of checked it out a little bit here and there, studied some martial arts. Um, you follow the different variations and genres of fighting, the different sciences behind, fighting for smaller individuals. Like Wing Chun was developed by like a female monk, you know,
Mhm.
and then you pass that up all the way till Bruce Lee, right? Who we all know and adore. Um, Bruce Lee was like the gate or rather a sponge. He learned every style, everything that he possibly could until he finally realized, after listening to all those influences like we do in music, or
Mm.
learning all those styles in the martial arts, he realized there was no one way, and so he created Jeet Kune Do to kind of like, open the gate up a little bit, to say there isn't a technique. There's not one technique. Um, so I think Horace Silver, to me anyway, and maybe maybe this is a stretch a little bit, but to me, Horace Silver was a bridge. That's why he is attributed so strongly, like you said, with Art Blakey, as somebody who started a movement of music, because he took everything going on and opened up the door for everybody else to come.
Yeah.
That's Horace Silver.
Yeah, I agree. And then also, sometimes we look at music as purely just as its own individual art form. But Blue Note Records at that time was specifically targeting a certain audience. And I think there was a real movement, or almost a decree that came down that, hey, you have to give us at least one song that could possibly be a jukebox type of a hit, like A Song for My Father. I mean, you had, prior to that, he had done The Preacher, which had this crossover success with the Messengers, and then not too, a little before that, Lee Morgan with The Sidewinder had this crossover sort of thing, and Blue Note Records was very much in tune with that. They knew that they wanted artists that could sell, and beyond just a very specific jazz audience.
Yeah, that's the business side of things, which you can't separate as much as we would like to, as artists. You can't separate that there is a business here. And so I don't doubt that. But I think Horace, maybe he found a way to be able to, do both without compromise, because I will go as far as to say that he wrote Song for My Father, and Blue Note said, we need a Song for My Father type tune on this record. And it's like, hey, I got this tune. I don't think, I highly doubt, knowing, who he was, and the kind of person, the kind of artist he was, um, I doubt that he wrote Song for My Father as a marketing
Oh yeah,
ploy,
I agree. Yeah,
so there was no compromise there at all. But you're right on the side of the business. And Blue Note, eventually he left Blue Note because, and started his own label, because Blue Note stopped going the direction that even he was going in, and they were trying to do something totally different with the label. So that wasn't flowing. And so that speaks volumes. I mean, again, imagine an artist of his time, of his stature, and saying, you know what, I don't even want to be with this record company anymore because they're going against me as an artist. I'm going to start my own label. I mean, that's incredible that he
yeah,
did that eventually.
yeah. I don't think it was a compromise at all. I mean, I think it was just right. It was a perfect unity. The music he was making was marketable.
Right.
There could have been The Natives Are Restless that has that, a kind of a groove that people could connect to, I think, or K Pasa, any pretty much most of the tunes on this. But it was a cool marriage for some time, and they definitely put a lot of thought and promotion into Horace Silver as an artist,
Oh yeah.
particularly on this time period. But um, anything else, Steve? I mean, it was fantastic. Anything else you want to say about Horace Silver or the album, or anything for that matter?
Just that, the more I get into my own life and career, and as a pianist and composer, I owe a tremendous amount of debt to, what Horace Silver gave us, and I'm forever humbled by that. And I will be. He's always going to be one of my top influences. So I'm just thankful that there is a Horace Silver that we can get on here and talk about. And I would encourage, just to encourage everybody to check it out, and really listen to the music and dive into the man, and dive into the compositions and the life story, because it's fascinating and it's very inspiring. As I mentioned before, some of the stuff he was doing even later on, with medical field and so forth. It's what an innovator. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts on Horace Silver. Just I'm going to keep studying and learning his music, and hopefully not to imitate and not to like I'm not real big into like transcribing solos like firsthand, and I mean I transcribe just to kind of figure some stuff out and maybe be inspired, but certainly to just listen and absorb and try to just grab. Thankfully, we have the recordings, and we can turn on Horace Silver and we could listen and make that a part of our soul if we should choose, and if that resonates with us. So yeah, that's just my encouragement to others, and again, just to put that thanks and gratitude out to Mr. Silver and his music.
Excellent. Well, Steve, thanks for joining me today. I really enjoyed having you.
Thanks for having me, Jay. Great podcast. I've listened to all of them so far, and I really love it. So I hope your listeners check it all out. You're
All
doing
right.
great work here, man.
Nice. I appreciate that. And we'll have you back again, I hope.
Love to do it anytime.
All right, let's drop the needle on track number 1. Side number 1 is the title track, Song for My Father, which is the album showpiece and Horace Silver's most famous tune. The song clocks in at over 7 minutes long, and it features Horace Silver on piano, Carmel Jones on trumpet, the legendary Joe Henderson on tenor saxophone, Teddy Smith on bass, and Roger Humphreys on the drums. Now, according to Silver, the song was, in part, inspired by our Brazilian trip. We got the Brazilian rhythm for the tune from that trip, and the melodic line was inspired by some very old Cape Verdean Portuguese folk music. One of the amazing aspects of the tune is that it's only 4 chords, and the magic lies not within the harmony, but within the memorable melodic theme, that folk theme, and the overall rhythmic feel. At around 1 minute and 40 seconds, Horace Silver plays the first solo. And again, he's never overly flashy, but he has a fine ability to connect phrases, particularly short phrases, and an ability to also create an overall soundscape in the same fashion in which he creates as a composer. I've often felt that his improvisations are very reflective of his compositional style. At around 3 minutes and 57 seconds, let's call it 4 minutes, Joe Henderson begins his improvisation. Henderson was one of the premier saxophonists of the mid-1960s and beyond. Consistent with his style, Henderson blends a beautiful tone, a level of extreme technicality, and an overall tastefulness within his improvisation. I hope you enjoy this classic, Song for My Father. Track number 2 is The Natives Are Restless Tonight. It's a more upbeat presentation that begins with a Latin groove before shifting to swing. Taking the first solo is trumpeter Carmel Jones. Jones is not regularly discussed among the great jazz trumpeters, but his solo on this piece reveals that maybe he belongs somewhat in that discussion. Jones might be further recognized in the US, but by the time of this release, he had already relocated to Germany, where he remained until 1980. Joe Henderson, on the other hand, has been widely celebrated for his mastery, which he displays at around 1 minute and 45 seconds into the tune. And at around 3 minutes, Silver takes his turn as a soloist, and although he reveals a certain degree of technique, his left-hand chording is often heavy-handed on this track, and sometimes distracts from the melodicism of his line. Silver is best as a soloist when he creates and builds off short melodic ideas and reference points from the main melody. Following Silver's solo is bassist Teddy Hill, who plays a walking bass solo at around 4 minutes and 30 seconds, after which drummer Roger Humphreys plays an impressive drum solo. Humphreys had played with a host of celebrated musicians, but his most memorable sessions came as a member of Horace Silver's group between 1964 and 1965. The Natives Are Restless Tonight, so enjoy their music. Track number 3 of side number 1 is Calcutta Cutie. It's a more subdued piece that really takes the listeners on a journey. The song offers a unique melodic line played by trumpeter Blue Mitchell and saxophonist Junior Cook, both well-regarded jazz instrumentalists. At 1 minute and 30 seconds or thereabout, Horace Silver offers the first solo, and the rhythm section, which now includes bassist Gene Taylor and drummer Roy Brooks, moves between a more relaxed Latin groove into moments of more traditional swing. Silver's playing of more Latin forms offers some fantastic and tasteful moments. At around 5 minutes and 15 seconds, Roy Brooks takes a solo by using the mallets. This may have been an attempt at trying to reference an African or Indian drumming style by using those mallets. Silver retakes center stage during a somewhat nebulous section before the main melody is presented. The song does not end there, however, as Silver returns to a more open section before fading out. The piece clocks in at about 8 minutes and 30 seconds, but it's never stagnant or boring. Calcutta is the home to Eastern India's film industry, which is often called Tollywood. The city also holds many of India's most important cultural centers, like the Academy of Fine Arts, the Victoria Memorial, the National Library of India, and the Indian Museum. Que pasa? What's up? What's going on? How are we doing? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. It is time to flip the record and drop the needle on side number 2, track number 1, which is called Que Pasa, another Horace Silver original, which feels somewhat similar to Song for My Father. And as with the title track, Horace Silver plays the first solo. Drummer Roy Brooks does a fine job of setting the mood behind Horace Silver's solo. Listen for him specifically. Then a highlight happens at around 3 minutes and 50 seconds when Joe Henderson enters with his improvisation. It's a fantastic solo that is perfectly executed, and few can play with as much soulfulness, imagination as Joe Henderson. Following Henderson's solo, the rhythm section quiets things down and plays an interlude before the main melodic return. And that's what's up. Track number 2 of side number 2 is The Kicker, which is written by Joe Henderson and is the only piece not written by Horace Silver on the original LP. The song is played at a breakneck speed and offers a very tightly played melody with precise rhythmic kicks. It is one of Joe Henderson's most celebrated pieces. Henderson's solo showcases his extreme mastery over the tenor saxophone, and his playing puts him in a category with saxophone legends like Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, and Dexter Gordon. Carmel Jones enters with his own fine solo at around 2 minutes, and he again displays why he might be one of the generation's most underappreciated jazz trumpeters. Horace Silver enters with his solo at around 3 minutes, but instead of trying to match the fire of Henderson and Jones, he stays within the nature of his solo style by playing mostly well-connected sequences. At around 4 minutes and 15 seconds, drummer Roger Humphreys takes center stage and plays an awe-inspiring drum solo in the fashion of Art Blakey. The melodic line is then presented to close out this fantastic album cut. The Kicker. Track number 3 of side number 2 is Lonely Woman. The original LP concludes with this track. It's an original Horace Silver ballad that showcases the pianist playing in a trio format with bassist Gene Taylor and drummer Roy Brooks. The track leans towards a more subtle, cool jazz display, and Silver plays with a lighter touch and a greater sensitivity. At over 7 minutes long, the piece does seem to drag a little bit for me, and it might have been of more interest had a second melodic voice split the solo section with Horace Silver. But nonetheless, it is a really fine track that showcases Horace Silver playing in a slightly different way. So enjoy Lonely Woman. All right, my friends, we did it. We've enjoyed Horace Silver's A Song for My Father, and we are better for it. And unless you have a more recent reissue, which has alternate tracks, it's time to lift the needle off of the record and put the album away, and let's discuss. In conclusion, A Song for My Father is a jazz classic and should be part of every music fan's collection. The album received 5 out of 5 stars from All Music Guide and the Encyclopedia of Popular Music. The Rolling Stones Jazz Guide gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and the Penguin Guide to Jazz gave it a perfect mark of 4 out of 4 stars. Now, after the album Song for My Father, Horace Silver continued to lead groups for decades and record numerous albums, many on Blue Note Records. Musically active for most of his life, Horace Silver died in 2014 at the age of 85. He is a member of the Downbeat Jazz Hall of Fame. All right. I want to thank you once again for enjoying the podcast, or hopefully you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed doing it. And I do want to thank Steve Myerson for joining me as well. So check him out. SteveMyerson.com, I believe, is where you can find more information about what's going on with him. For more information on the podcast, go to 30albumsfor30years.com. Check us out on social media. We also broadcast these shows on YouTube as well. So together, let's keep this music alive, and join me next time for yet another classic album for 1965. Have a wonderful day.